happy to be able to talk a little bit about this book on behalf of my co-author Mark Vaz and myself, and the origin story behind how this happened. Well, briefly, Mark Vaz is actually more of a film historian, and he's also done long-form biography and is a New York Times best-selling author. He's got 40 titles under his belt. So Mark was doing a story, a biography on an individual named Marion Cooper. Marion Cooper had 2 or 3 careers. He was a World War I aviator who went on to be an original director of Pan American and then left to do film. So Mark was doing this work on this individual who had had a career at Pan American as well and was filling out the Pan Am chapter. So he came into the facility here and I gave him a research interview, and Julie and her staff were facilitating his research needs, and he spent a lot of time here. So at one point we went for lunch and I told him, I said, you know, Mark, there's a whole nother side to the Pan Am history that is really not that well known, not even among Pan Am employees, particularly any post-war people or the general public who remember Pan Am as a great, airline. And he goes, what is that? I said, well, this is the relationship with the United States government and the projection of power and prestige through air transport that was all embodied in this little startup in 1927 called Pan American Airways. So he thought, well, that's interesting, we should write a book. I said, good idea. So we did.
And once you agreed to really get started on it, how did you go through the process of putting the story together? What were your objectives? And tell us a little bit about the process of publishing a book.
So I had a pretty good working knowledge through my my tenure here at SFO. I also had a family connection to Pan American, which was sort of an O. Henry twist to my career. And I had grown up hearing some really marvelous stories about Pan American World Airways then. And I always knew that there was something special there. So as I evolved my knowledge on that, I had a sort of general contour and access to materials, a lot of which are here available to the public, to prevail upon and to really sort of fill out the broad brushstrokes of this story. And with the Freedom of Information Act and the time intervals, between the origin of the company and its role before and leading up to and through World War II, we thought we could get some fresh perspectives and assemble a lot of the pieces about this story into one vertical alignment, into a single book, to kind of captivate and give credit where credit is due for the one part. We also wanted to take this story into a broader spectrum of general public trade publications, as opposed to sort of a self-published, handout book among devotees of aviation history, but to make it a bigger story, thinking that it had greater appeal. So Mark, who was an established author, had an agent. So on one vacation trip back to New York City, where I was born, I paid a visit, I think it was on Madison Avenue, to his agent and to pitch the book. And I didn't get very far with the first couple of sentences before he said, I'm in, I'm sold. So then it was about writing it.
Do you remember how you pitched it, or what were some of the things that you said that obviously were so effective?
Yeah, well, I said, first of all, we think of Pan Am, and many of us remember and had the privilege of flying Pan Am. Hopefully it was a good experience. It usually was. It was a highly regarded airline. But I said, the basic facts are the Pan Am was not just another airline. Post-war generation, you talk about maybe the big fours: Pan Am, United, American, TWA. But Pan Am was not just equal, it was not just first among equals, it was first on so many fronts. When you do research on air transport and how to put together a long-haul over-ocean flying system, Pan Am's name pops up dozens of times. They really drew the blueprints. So I explained that, and then I said, but how that happened is really interesting. It's a group of highly motivated, very patriotic individuals with great talent who were able to draw talent and work in multiple dimensions on, diplomacy, international relations, technology, geography, business planning, finance, all of that. It turns out this individual, this agent in New York, is a big sailor. and he had learned his navigational skills from Captain William Maslin, who was a very storied, legendary Pan Am flying boat captain. So he was already a leg up on this general knowledge and was hooked, by really 3-4 minutes into the conversation.
Let's, if you're ready, let's dive in a little bit to the storyline of this book, and maybe if you want to start by kind of teeing it up a little bit for us, and maybe kind of setting the stage for the narrative that the readers can look forward to.
Yeah, there's a lot of this. And I will say, in the process of the publishing, so to get to that, we had an agent who was going to go out and try and sell this book to a publishing house. So the next step was to write 18 or so of the 24 chapters. So that took about 2 years. It was 2 years of intensive work, and Mark did a lot of the heavy lift on the compositional side of it. And then it went out, and then we waited for the rejections to roll in. So that took quite a while, and one of the feedback pieces that we got from a lot of these publishing houses was that we were using the term war, and to a publisher, apparently they're very market-oriented, and they're very inclined to pigeonhole books into certain categories. War to them connotes, December 1941 to, August 1945. Well, our whole premise was that Pan Am's efforts starting in 1927 were a struggle for air supremacy, sort of a soft, Cold War, as air transport as a soft power as opposed to air power. So that was a kind of a turnoff. Turns out, I will say that one of the best parts of that experience, and rejection is sometimes hard to handle, but wasn't that surprising. It's hard to get a book sold, apparently. So the book puts a lot of weight and space into the formative years of Pan Am in 1927, and it really comes off of the post-World War I era, and the state of air transport was basically that the United States was really behind the 8 ball after World War I. World War I was a proving ground for the technology of the airplane. It had a role to play in the outcome as far as, a weapon of war, but it wasn't anything to what it was going to become, certainly in the next conflict, global conflict, when they started numbering them, from the Great War to World War II. And Europe was way ahead of us. There was at the armistice, we had ramped up our production, and there was a massive surplus here. You could buy an OX-5 engine in the crate with 0 hours on it for $25, or an old Jenny for $150, and everybody was sort of lying around, on that. Whereas the European urban centers were jumping into this new form of transport with both feet. A lot of their infrastructure had been incapacitated, railroads, etc. And if you draw a straight line from a lot of the urban centers of Europe down through the west coast of Africa, the jump across to South America is not that far. It's much less distance than it is across the northern Atlantic to North America. So there was an incursion going on of European, what would become Axis interests, operating in the Western Hemisphere, vis-a-vis Colombia, and some German airlines that were doing very successful startup work by 1919. When the ink had hardly dried on the Versailles Treaty. So that's where we kind of begin, and it was individuals like Hap Arnold, General Henry Arnold, who's a main character, along with Juan Trippe, the founder, or the president, I should say, of Pan American. In many regards, Arnold was in fact the founder of Pan American, because he coined that term and formed the seed company to bid for a mail contract from Florida to Havana. So we start there to kind of sketch that out. Germany, Italy, France were way ahead of us in aviation. And through this vehicle, Pan American Airways system, we caught up and surpassed them in very few years, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. This company had expanded out through the Caribbean basin and encompassed all of Central and South America, save the southern cone. So that's really an important piece to show how aviation and air transport became a technology that projected the power and prestige of this emerging superpower, the United States. So we tried to carry the point that it's a technology like that. Shipbuilding enabled the British to, Britannia ruled the waves in the 19th century. The Romans could build roads. You can go back to the stirrup, and the Mongol horde, with the invention of the stirrup, was able to sack all of Asia and half of Europe. So it's these little pieces of technology that are usually the tools with which there's an empire projected, and the point is that this was our empire, and aviation was our means, and Pan American was the operator of that projection. So it starts very, very early and then takes us up. And all along the way, there's this little thing called regulation that started to creep into air transport, and their idea was to always fly over water, and over water flying was extremely challenging. So we start and kind of bring together the pieces and how the relationship with governmental agencies at the highest level enabled this partnership to embody this ability to take the United States from way behind to the leading edge of aeronautics.
It's amazing. And do I understand that there's kind of a correlation to the Panama Canal in this story as well?
Right, thank you. So it was App Arnold who said, hey, we got to get going. You know, the Germans are operating within 200 miles of the Panama Canal, our canal. You know, it's a very hegemonistic approach to hemispheric security. So Pan Am was formed to gain a mail contract starting, you know, across the Florida Strait, 95 miles. To fly that on a regular basis with a payload in 1927 was a big challenge, technologically and operationally. So the idea was to get down there and to compete, if not eradicate, what would become the Axis interests for security purposes. So the Panama Canal was actually the defining, you know, objective from the government security side, and Pan American was the solution or the tip of the spear to neutralize that potential threat. It takes about 20 minutes to shift a, you know, commercial air transport into a military plane, so they weren't taking any chances.
Is there a reading you'd like to take us through that really kind of captures this era and time that the book covers?
There is, and we spend a lot of time in the book trying to flesh out some of these amazing individuals and the talent pool that were attracted to Pan Am. So I'm going to read from this chapter 5, which is the aviator and the airline. And some of these individuals, Tripp we've mentioned, but we introduce Andre Priester and Hugo Leuteritz. We're in the first full year of the formation of Pan American Airways, which would be 1928. By December, its parent company, Aviation Corporation of the Americas, moved into a suite of rooms at the Channon Building at 122 East 42nd Street, across from Grand Central Terminal. It was also across the street from the Chrysler Building, which was under construction, where they would move next. Tripp had one office, Chief Engineer Andre Priester the other. Chief Communications Engineer Hugo Leuteritz's office was a chair pulled up to Priester's desk. Tripp's roll-top desk was against a wall with a table behind him. When he had visitors, he turned and talked across it. Tripp never left without closing his roll-top, leaving some wondering what secrets lay within. One old-timer recalled, Tripp was more like our god, and Priester was our boss, particularly at Key West, where he was the face of the company. Andre Priester's early life was that of the Arabian Nights. He descended from a sea captain shipwrecked off the coast of Java, where Andre's father was provincial governor. When Andre was born in 1892, his birth certificate was witnessed and signed by several Rajas. He grew up in surroundings akin to a royal court, a privileged life that ended at age 16 when his father died. Eager to see the world, he signed on with the crew of a cargo ship. Before Tripp hired him, Priester distinguished himself at Kolinkalaka Lukvart Metrapi voor Noordland aan Kolinanen, also blessedly known as KLM, as the Royal Dutch Airline, and my apologies to any native Dutch speakers. He was considered the first employee at the East 42nd Street office. Priester helped transform aviation's barnstorming culture into a business through strict rules of operation and emphasis on safety. As the airline expanded, he pragmatically favored flying boats as the aircraft carried its own airport, a necessity as there were no airports or emergency landing fields in the Caribbean or Brazil's coastline, but plenty of bays, rivers, lakes, and lagoons. Priester demanded that pilots reserve fuel and daylight. A flying boat landing at night in dark harbors risked crashing into driftwood or unlit fishing boats, and he would cancel an overwater flight if seas were too rough. Priester also believed in radio, a technology starting to come into its own. He believed radio was the answer to tracking and reporting changing weather conditions to airborne planes and airfields on the Key West to Havana route. and points beyond. He brought aboard Loiteritz to lead Pan Am's radio communications effort. Hugo Loiteritz is one of the promising young wizards in the field when he joined the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, in New York. He acquired his amateur radio operator's license at age 13, researched radio at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and served as a junior radio expert aide in the Navy during World War I. When Loiteritz arrived at RCA, radio was about transmitting dots and dashes. Equipment was bulky and heavy. For 8 years, he focused on long-distance communications with less bulky equipment. Developments vital in adapting radio to aircraft. Finally, RCA directed the 28-year-old to investigate radio's aviation possibilities. The company was not ready to commit, Loiteritz discovered when he requested $25,000 to research a lightweight transmitter receiver. They said aviation was not ready for spending that kind of money, Loiteritz recalled. Fate intervened when Loiteritz got a call from Grant Mason and John Montgomery. They were directors at Pan American Airways. Around the time of the merger with the Trip Hamilton Whitney Group. They were investigating this radio thing, Loiteritz recalled. They had no idea what they wanted. They only knew they wanted radio for communications and perhaps some navigation. Loiteritz, still an RCA employee, took a train to Key West to begin experimental work for the airline. RCA was interested. Their research indicated Key West was a bad static area and would provide a good equipment test. The day after Loiteritz arrived at Key West, a boat followed with a 100-watt RCA transmitter. Loiteritz had done radio work for Colonial Air Transport, which Tripp was the president of, in 1926, but when he met Tripp for the second time, the conversation took an unexpected turn, and he was offered a job. "Andre will have nobody else but you," Loiteritz replied. Loiteritz replied the Pan Am only had a few planes and wondered if that would keep him busy. "We will have a fleet of airplanes to fly to Latin America, the Atlantic, the Pacific," Tripp answered. "What you're talking about is a gamble," Loiteritz said. He also thought, one of us is nuts. Flying the oceans? Perhaps it was the audaciousness of Tripp's vision, but Loiteritz discussed the job offer with his boss at RCA, C.H. Taylor. Loiteritz decided to take the gamble, and Taylor graciously allowed a one-year leave of absence. The leave became permanent. Loiteritz was the start of Pan Am's radio division. It was a humble beginning, Loiteritz recalled. The only thing I had was the transmitter in Key West, and that was property of RCA.
Great reading, thank you, and such a good snapshot of some of the stories that are to be told within those pages. So we've been talking thus far really about the Cold War, to use your term, Pan Am's effort to become supreme in this developing industry, but this book is also about the role that Pan Am played as a hot war, as a true conflict was developing, and maybe we'll start kind of in the Pacific, which is an area that we traditionally think of with Pan Am, although for a different type of reason. Maybe let's start about Pan Am's role as wartime was coming into focus.
Yeah, that's sort of the premise. You know, World War II has sort of a debatable origin. Was it, the Japanese imperial incursion into China in the mid-30s, way before, December of 1941 when we were in the war, the United States was in the war. So the next, after success in the Caribbean where the overwater ocean flying development happened, Pan Am was ready to fly an actual ocean, and they always anticipated flying the Atlantic first. And in one of the great reversals or paradoxes of history, they ended up flying the Pacific. They had diplomatic blocks to the Atlantic. They couldn't overcome, they knew they could fly the distance between the maritime provinces and the British Isles or the continent of Europe, which was only about a 1,900-mile water gap. But the British had different ideas and didn't want any U.S. carriers coming in until British carriers could come to North America. They wanted reciprocity. The only problem being the British didn't have aircraft capable of flying transport that distance. So that stalled. They ended up pouring all their attention to the Pacific and ruled out the Alaska bridgehead to Asia and decided they'd have to break the Hawaii sector. So the mid-Pacific was going to be the route, the first route that they did. And of course, as the stories around us tell us, they did. By 1935, they installed an air route across 8,000 plus miles of Pacific Ocean with intervals along the way, Hawaii being the first stop. In the meantime, Japan had made expansive efforts into mainland China and had also declared certain island chains in the mid-Pacific region to be part of their empire. Notably, several of these were south of where the Pan Am route would fly. So in their minds, this route cut right across their empire. And there was great protestations. It was an interesting sort of four-dimensional chess game going on. And these island bases, tiny little coral atolls such as Midway and Wake, which nobody knew about, everybody had forgotten since the Guano Act of 1856, became hugely important strategic geopolitical locations and eventually, of course, household names. So that created tension, and the Navy was only too happy to facilitate logistically the expansion and development of these seaplane bases, because they were still going to use flying boats, and kind of pull back their military presence in the Pacific, because now this private U.S. enterprise was putting a commercial route across the broadest ocean in the planet. And lo and behold, in an amazing feat, by 1935, before the bridges were even complete across the San Francisco Bay, 32 years after Kitty Hawk, Pan Am opened regular scheduled commercial service in heavier than air aircraft across the Pacific Ocean. So that created tension. There was a lot of diplomatic channel talk from Japan that were protesting this. But when you look in the press, you see these little articles are buried on like page 14. You know, there wasn't a lot of receptiveness to their entreaties to not do this. So Pan Am was already engaged on that front. At the same time, they were still trying to forge the Atlantic. And indeed, before we entered World War II, the United States entered World War II, Pan Am was flying Lend-Lease material off of the hump of South America from Natal, Brazil to the west coast of Africa. And, oh, by the way, as Churchill and Roosevelt asked Tripp, could you build an air route across Africa, hooking up through Mesopotamia, as we used to call it. So they were engaged in that other front. So these are three fronts: north-south in the Western Hemisphere, west to Asia, and east to Africa and Europe. So this single entity airline was already in the middle of this geopolitical intrigue as a peacetime enterprise.
And can you kind of take us forward into the next few years and talk a little bit about how Pan Am's role evolved really as hostilities began and more importantly, as the United States entered the war?
Yeah. So picture, if you will, and the reason I picked Leuteritz out with respect to radio was he ended up developing and sort of perfecting the Adcock Direction Finder, which was a navigational radio technology that was proprietary to Pan American. Nobody else had this technology. And they were still, you know, these highly trained flying boat crews, their navigators were still shooting stars, they were still using dead reckoning, but it was the radio direction finder that could help them pinpoint these tiny little islands. So imagine, if you will, the dawning of a global conflict whose outcome would largely be determined by air power, aviation. And your side, your country, has the one entity, Pan American, that can fly across the oceans. Nobody else could do it. So you can't say overnight, but certainly come December 7th and 8th of 1941, Pan Am was thrust to the forefront as a hugely important strategic asset to move material, not in great quantities like surface ships, but safely over, sea battles and the incursion of, say, U-boat forces in the North Atlantic that were sinking ships, left, right, and center, to move people, i.e., high-level military people, and to move intelligence, information. So this was almost a secret weapon that was developed. And the fact was that the capacity was hair thin because they had a small fleet, single lines, but it was the capability upon which everything else was built, and that would become Air Transport Command, Naval Air Transport Services. So overnight, Pan Am's fleet was handed over, basically conscripted to the U.S. government. Tripp worked out his relationship with Roosevelt to keep his personnel civilian. They actually wanted to put Tripp in front of, in charge of Air Transport Command, but he worked out a deferment situation with Selective Service with Roosevelt's blessing, because he knew he could do more in the private sector, so to speak. But they were highly coordinated and communicating, and Pan Am wasn't just rolled in to what would become, these massive airlifts of material. There's comments in the book about, it wasn't like Arnold used Pan Am for the Air Transport Command or CNAC to fly the hump routes in Asia through the back door to China. Air Transport Command was Pan Am. These were the pilots who knew how to do it. These were the navigators who trained thousands of RAF and Canadian Air Force crews and US crews on how to do this, on the technology and the operational procedures to successfully fly across these great spaces. So this was a case of the exact need at the exact moment, and it helped propel the war effort on all theaters.
It's amazing. John, would you mind sharing another excerpt with us, maybe one that kind of captures what we've been talking about for the last few minutes?
Sure. I'm going to jump ahead to one instance where now we're in the war. This is in chapter 22 called Militarization. It's an easy partnership between trying to see, where Tripp's interest and Arnold's interest intersected. And Tripp was a hugely patriotic individual. He was smart enough to spend most of his time in Washington, where a lot of his competitors were fixated on, working on the line or down at the end of the line. He captivated the imagination in Washington, D.C. There's a phrase called the chosen instrument, which is used usually to try and counterbalance or negate Pan Am's advantages. They certainly had advantages, but I never thought it was as extreme as some people say. They were outcompeted, and maybe there's some sour grapes there. But if anybody knows, in Washington, for every friend you have at least one enemy. So, but Tripp was very savvy at this. But now we're in the war. Tripp had been personally asked by Churchill and FDR to form two subsidiaries: Pan American Air Ferries, which was going to transport aircraft material, equipment across the South Atlantic to the Allied war effort to the west coast of Africa, and Pan Africa. So the Africa Corps was formed. This became the Cannonball Run, and the tonnage is astounding what they moved. But now we're in 1942, and the United States is fully engaged here. But the Pan Am crews are still private for a while longer. And something's happening in North Africa. Hitler's General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, is waging war against the British and trying to take Cairo so he can control the Suez Canal. Again, the canal comes into the picture. So that summer, Rommel was at the gates of Cairo, and British forces were desperately short of anti-tank fuses to repel the advance. At midnight on July 3, British military headquarters made an urgent call to Accra. Montgomery needed 15 tons of anti-tank artillery fuses and 50 caliber ammunition. 6 PAA Africa crews were awakened and prepared for immediate departure to the British port of Lagos, 3,100 miles away, to pick up the vital supplies then being unloaded. Most of them, Pan-Africa pilots, were looking forward to a well-earned sleep, and fuses, which exploded so easily, are the kind of cargo pilots preferred not to fly. But there was no hesitation on the part of any of them. The first planes took off at 4 in the morning. Khartoum was the last stop for a crew change before Cairo. The mission continued for 33 straight hours, delivering on a special day for Americans, 4th of July. One of the PA Africa airmen was Ridge Hamill, who later survived crashing in the Himalayas. By 4 p.m., the first plane was contacting Cairo's Heliopolis field, asking permission to land there or the battlefront. An incredulous RAF officer reportedly replied, "I say, old man, that really isn't funny. This is no time for spoofing." They didn't even know that this flight was coming in. It was so secret. By then, the second plane was arriving. The battlefront had no proper runways, so they landed at Heliopolis. The dangerous cargo was loaded onto trucks and immediately driven to the fighting. In the course of the following hours, 15 tons of fuses were brought in. They were delivered to the front. The gunners armed their shells and loaded their anti-tank guns almost as the Germans moved to the attack. Rommel was thrown back, but in no small part because of the fast action of the command soldier-civilian team. All rules were off. Airplanes were overloaded, with bad tires, with radios inoperative. Airplanes flew with only one generator working. Pan Am's corporate history records. For some of the young captains, the pace got pretty fast. It was scary to go up. Alone at the controls of the monstrous machine, the DC-3 was that, then and loaded with explosives, ready to flash. The fuse lift alone made the whole Africa line worth having. When the conquest of Cairo seemed imminent, PA Africa flew evacuation missions and 49 RAF ferry pilots from Cairo to Takoradi to facilitate delivery of British warplanes. Pan Am's communication system provided vital weather information during the planning of the North African invasion. The militarization of PAA Africa Limited was but a month from completion when the gigantic North African invasion occurred in November '42. Voight Gilmore recorded in 1943. Former Pan American personnel who had joined the Army played key roles in the opening up of the North African country. Equipment and aviation facilities previously obtained and established by Pan American were used extensively throughout the operation. So that's but one example of special mission flying, which became, sort of the watchword for Pan Am's plan, but yet impromptu heroics throughout the entirety of the war in all theaters.
What a story. So, John, we were talking about really kind of how Pan Am initially intended to begin in the Atlantic area and then, based on the British influence, found itself really first establishing its expertise across the Pacific, but eventually they did establish themselves in the Atlantic. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with readers about kind of the Atlantic side of the story here?
Yeah, so the Atlantic side is fascinating. Of course, it took until 1939 to open the Atlantic route. So the North Atlantic route went up through the Maritimes and did the 1,900-mile water gap to the British Isles. The Mid-Atlantic route went out of Baltimore and New York and utilized Bermuda and then the Azores and flew into Lisbon. That route, the North Atlantic route, was stopped because of European conflict shortly after it was opened. But the second route down the globe to Lisbon became a vital link because Lisbon was a neutral port. Pan Am's traffic statistics skyrocketed, and for lack of a better word, it was a huge success, both from a business sense and for other reasons. Meanwhile, the South Atlantic route was mostly purely transport and ferrying operations, and that was going at an enormous clip once that opened too. So the Atlantic was very, very busy, and after the Pacific, it had several years from 1935 to 1941 of peacetime operations and was a big success. Some of the equipment was brought out of the Pacific because by now a lot of military transports were being turned over, and Pan Am crews were flying those and sharing those flying duties in the Pacific. But one particular aircraft was brought out, was the China Clipper, the famous flying boat that really caught the world's attention when it opened regular service in November of 1935. It was retrofitted. It had been painted battleship gray in the Pacific. It was stripped and repainted to its silver because they wanted to resume, ostensibly, commercial service to Leopoldville. So they wanted it to look like it wasn't military. The Leopoldville route had been closed, and the problem was that the State Department wouldn't reopen it. The War Department desperately wanted it reopened because they wanted to start shipping uranium out of the Belgian Congo for the Manhattan Project. And they had lost several supplies and surface vessels going out of Lisbon that had been sunk by German U-boats. So who do you call? You call Pan Am. And the problem was the State Department didn't know about the Manhattan Project. War Department, of course, did. So there was some very creative maneuvering to reevaluate and recertify the Leopold route. And one of the reasons was there was a missionary group who were desperate to get resumed flights back into Central Africa to resume their work. So that was sort of the front for reopening the Leopold route. And the China Clipper ended up on these super top secret special mission flights to take uranium ore out of the Belgian Congo, which was the richest source of uranium in the world, some of which was transported on the China Clipper and went directly into the end chapter of the Manhattan Project and the serviceable loads that were detonated in World War II.
Amazing. So John, you talked a little bit about your partnership with Mark. Knowing kind of what you know now, what advice would you give to somebody that is thinking about embarking on the process of making a book a reality?
Yeah, good question. Well, if you're unable to partner with a New York Times best-selling author, which is a huge advantage in the process, you really have to crystallize, what the story is. I think you have to sort of contrast it. This is what I guess in the publishing world they call an alternative history, because it looks like at large, major historical events through a different lens, i.e. air transport, specifically this company, Pan American. So it already has a different angle. Then you have to sort of figure out how you're going to make that a compelling story. If you're targeting a certain segment of the market, because this is a market trade publication. If you're looking for scholarly work, and I guess my hint would be never use the word scholarly when you're pitching to an agent who's trying to sell a book to a publishing house, unless it's a textbook company, because that's not what they're into. They like the sizzle and the intrigue and that. So you have to convey the passion and the excitement, and try and excite a sense of discovery in the material that you're going to unearth and provide.
And John, you were talking earlier about how as this was being shopped to various publishers, there were some that wanted to cut the book, wanted to begin the timeline, and you talked about that very matter-of-factly. Was that a difficult decision to hold your ground? I mean, did you worry about the book not ever getting published when you made that call?
I say yes, yes, and yes. It took 6 years to get a publisher once this book was ready to send out. Now, the game apparently is the agent will tap all of his contacts at all these big publishing houses, and they'll chew on it for a while. Then they'll come back and say yay or nay. If they say no, you don't go back to them for a while, because you don't want to bug them and pester them. So it takes a couple of years to resubmit something. So when Macmillan was interested and we said no, that was hard to say no. Now, we cut this book down already. This is a sprawling story. I will tell you, I will challenge anybody to tell me what's a bigger story, at least geographically, than this story about a global air transport system running through 6 continents with 80,000 miles. And, I don't know what a bigger story is until we colonize space. We stuck to our guns, and we determined that we would self-publish if we had to. And we let it sit, and our agent kept, at it every couple of years. He'd resubmit, and so it finally happened. Something interesting, we tweaked the title because people were getting hung up on war. Pan Am at War has a nice short, bite to it. So we changed it to something cheesy like Wings of Democracy or The Power of Flight or something like that. And it went out again under that title. It was actually bought with that title, which I've blocked from thinking about it because I didn't like it. And partway through the editorial process, after we had signed a publishing agreement, the editor comes back and says, "We've been thinking about the title. We got a new idea. How about Pan Am at War?" We said, "Love it. It's great." So it came back to its original title. It found its way back to the original title. So that was
That's
interesting.
amazing. And make them think it was their idea, right? So having gone through this process, which took years and years to really come to fruition, to bring us to this point, would you do it again? Would you go through this process again of trying to put a book together and put it to market? And if so, what would be another story of aviation history that you would want to tell, a story that interests you?
Well, I have to split that question into two parts. Would I do it again if I was still working full-time in a very energized and dynamic workplace that soaked up a lot of my energies and attentions? Because that was the beauty of our partnership. You know, I would take, you know, my own time to pursue this part and work with Mark, but Mark was bird dogging a lot of this. He was on the road, you know, doing the research trips and this and that, and then we'd have these long sessions synthesizing that, and then he'd write, and then we'd comment. So, you know, I didn't have a ton of bandwidth to do that. Now my situation has changed. I have lots of bandwidth. So yes, I would take it on again. I would probably write something. In fact, I'm, you know, tinkering with a few projects right now in the writing vein.
We have a question from the audience. Yes, please.
I don't know where your book ends, but I'm really curious as to what ultimately happened to Pan Am, given that you've got this massive company.
There's two parts to the answer. The book ends really at the conclusion of World War II, so late 1945. It sort of has this sort of bittersweet vision now that Tripp has, you know, brought this company through this amazing period where he's ready to rightfully hold his mantle of, you know, global domination with respect to commercial aviation, and he wanted to maintain his monopolies on the ocean. That didn't happen. Hughes turned the tables on him, and TWA was able to muscle into the Atlantic routes. Eventually, Northwest would gain through regulation and fair, you know, trade practices rights to fly the Pacific. Tripp was trying to write the IATA code and sort of keep Pan Am, you know, as the de facto flag carrier without being a national airline. This is something else you have to understand. When you're competing with Lufthansa or Air France, you're talking to the state. And Pan Am used this very assiduously in the pre-war era, because when you talk to Pan Am, you're talking to a private entity. Because when they were negotiating with upwards of 80 foreign states, foreign countries at one point, and they had seasoned diplomats, you know, doing this work with them, sometimes with, sometimes without the State Department's knowledge or participation. And eventually these conversations always come around to reciprocity and concessions in North America for these other states. And at that point, the Pan Am representatives say, oh, you got to go talk to the State Department, that's not us. So that's something that happened. And rightfully, you know, in a free market economy and a representational democracy, there should be fair trade. And it was all about airmail contracts, and these became the sort of the flashpoint for advantage or disadvantage for competitive industry. So that sort of changed quickly after World War II. But then you're talking about 1991 and the eventual complete collapse of Pan American World Airways and its denouement of this great airline. What happened there was several very succinct business explanations can be pointed to, and a lot of you know this story. Some of you lived it personally and firsthand. But Pan Am ran into problems with competition in the international airline industry, and some of that had to do with deregulation. They couldn't move quickly enough. They weren't nimble enough. They were fixated on a national airline, a domestic airline. So the national merger happened, which a lot of people debate the wisdom behind that. There was a fleet purchase that drained them. There was a succession plan when Tripp finally left that wasn't clear, so there was a leadership vacuum perhaps. And they got into financial tailspin, and they started cannibalizing their subsidiaries. You know, they wholly owned Intercontinental Hotel. They sold Global Air Services, which rivaled the domestic core business. And these things started to break down and spiral. There's supposed to be a bridge loan from Delta, was it, who pulled out at the last minute. And they were bankrupt. And unlike a car company, the government didn't step in, and they ceased to exist. I look at this more in an organic way, and I always see this as sort of a Malthusian outcome, or if you know James G. Frazier, you know, in The Golden Bough, this was sort of the killing of the man god by the progeny, you know, at its peak. So the offspring consumed the parent. So Pan Am created and invented this industry that then turned around and consumed it and competed it out of business.
Hi. Just one question is, obviously the story really doesn't end with the end of World War II. So I imagine the special relationship continued, from what I understand from my stories I've heard, continued well through to the Vietnam War. So maybe you want to kind of pick up where you left off and give us a brief synopsis of the rest of the story.
Yeah, that's a great question because that's the next book. Pan Am and the Cold War, because you're absolutely right. That relationship stayed very close. There was now we're in a Cold War. There was a lot of conveyance of intelligence. There was some direct overlap between the intelligence community and Pan Am, which had always existed. A lot of this came out of New Haven. A lot of these were Yale graduates. Yale was a recruiting ground for the OSS and the CIA all the way through. So those intrigues through the Cold War, Pan Am had a very big role there too. The opening of China was another big step. And I don't know a lot about that from a deep level of understanding, but it's been discussed that maybe that would, whether it's Mark and I who do it or somebody else, but there's another story out there waiting to be brought together. I do know that Porter Goss, who you all remember was the last director of Central Intelligence before the administration was changed under the Homeland Security Act, has conveyed indirectly to me that he knows where these materials are and it's time for them to come out. So through FOIA, through a decent interval, through the changes in the geopolitical climate vis-a-vis superpowers in the Cold War, it's timely.
The flying boat fleet in 1941 in December in the Pacific, how was that dispersed after the war started, and which planes remained in the Pacific?
Yeah, most of them remained there. When the 314 came in 1939, which was late, Boeing was 3 years late, go figure, and on delivering those, 6 of those are broken off and given to the British so they could start their North Atlantic route so we could get going with ours. It was a nice arrangement. But most of the fleet stayed. Several planes were lost. One of the Sikorsky S-42 was burnt to the water line in Hong Kong. That's in the book. The Hawaii was lost mysteriously during commercial service. The Philippine Clipper was strafed with, whoever you read, depending on who you read, 22 or 60 some holes with, I think, 20 caliber machine gun fire from a Japanese Imperial fighter plane. I don't know if you count entry and exit wounds once or twice, but they limped back to Alameda, whistling all the way, and that survived, and then later was lost up in Ukiah in a tragedy. But the 314 stayed. The China was transferred to the Atlantic Division, as I mentioned earlier. Some of the 314s may have come back, but Ford brought his ship all the way around the long way after he was trapped behind enemy lines when Pearl Harbor was happening, and they were out in between New Zealand and New Caledonia, I think. So I think they mostly stayed there. Now what was happening, all these new planes, these PBYs and all these other military transports were coming in, so the fleet numbers were going up. These weren't traditional Pan Am fleets, but they were crewed by Pan Am crews. But I think most of the flying boat fleet in the Pacific remained in the Pacific. You'd have to sort of trace them down by one, but the bulk of them certainly did.
Hi, John. In listening to reading some of the passages from your book and some of your commentary, it strikes me that an underlying theme of your book is courage. And I'm wondering, based on your research and your reading and getting to know the central actors that are a part of this story, where did that come from? What are your observations about that?
That's a great question. This was the part of the impetus I spoke about earlier. This is air transport. Here, we've tended to crystallize our focus on air transport. There's plenty of military overlap. There's a vast military aviation history. I'm much weaker on that. But the air transport piece becomes a player all by itself, just the ability to do that. This was a frontier. This was new. And somehow, and I'm not sure, other than just being a great organization, and Pan Am was able to attract a certain caliber of individual. from the ground crews up to the 58th floor of the Chrysler Building. They were all remarkable people, and every Pan Amer I've met, speaks to that innate quality. So there was a sense, and it was a real-time sense, and there's a chapter named for this sentiment in the book called Clipper Glory. And it took a lot of bravery. There were many, many individuals who paid the ultimate price in the early days of aviation with their lives. But there was a sense of this new frontier. This was coming out of the Depression. There were war clouds on the horizon. The United States was maturing as a nation, and it somehow enamored this sort of heroic thread through these actions and deeds. And to move so quickly, Tripp was very, very smart about the importance of being first and the importance of momentum. So time was of the essence, to get these routes in, to establish. If you could fly a plane between one point to another and carry a bag of mail or a body, passenger service was almost an afterthought, but the mail contract was born. If you could do it once, that wasn't a big deal. If you could do it twice, and again, and repetitively, you had a utility. You had something to work with. So they knew this, and they knew that 90% of aviation takes place on the ground. So it was all infrastructure to support these flight operations. So they had the ability to see this as a business model, and there will never be another business model quite like Pan American Airways. The only sort of equivalent is the computer age or the information age, something like that. But this was working on so many fronts that it carried its own sort of dimension of excitement. So these were heroic accomplishments. When we talk about a route across the Pacific, you can't kick it, you can't touch it, but it's in league with the Panama Canal or the Brooklyn Bridge or the Intercontinental Railroad. It's that big a momentous maxi.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to the book signing portion of it now, but John, we want to say first and foremost, congratulations on the publishing of the book, and thank you so much for sharing a little bit of it with us today. Let's give John a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you all.